When there's a downturn, you can expect to see cutbacks in spending for public colleges and universities. Even with economic recovery, the effects on students can be felt for years, whether in the education experience or the overhang of debt. It's a problem for all students, but especially for many students of color. To discuss two reports on the problem are a policy analyst and state policy fellow focused on education with the Mass Budget and Policy Center, Anastasia Martinez, and the managing director of the Hildreth Institute, Dr. Bahar Akman Imboden. Thank you both very much for being with us. I want to start with Anastasia. I said, cuts from a downturn, even if the state budget is level funded for state colleges and universities, I imagine they're having some revenue problems right now. So what does that mean for these schools?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I want to start off really looking at where we've been as a state in terms of the budget for public higher education. Even for fiscal year 20, we were down 8% from fiscal year 2001. And right now, like you said, we haven't had any major cuts to the public higher ed budget, but we've never fully recovered to some of the major cuts that we saw happen during some of the other recessions. And then again, like you said, we are level funding, which is, again, great. But when we look at level funding, what that actually means, it means that colleges and universities are receiving about the same amount that they received last year. And the kind of big elephant in the room is there wasn't a pandemic last year. So a lot of these colleges and universities are going to have to figure out how are they helping students stay safe and healthy on campuses. And then another big point that we're seeing is that enrollment is really starting to fall. So some campuses aren't getting that housing revenue that they're really going to need.
I want to go back to the long-term trend because you said what it means for the colleges and universities. What does it mean for students and the cost of their education, how they're handling that cost?
Yeah, so like you said, over the past several years, the state funding has been decreasing for public higher education. And so a trend that we're seeing is as state funding decreases, our colleges and campuses are increasing their tuition and fees. And the price tag is being pushed on to the families and students. And so families and students are having to pay these increased costs. And then they're actually having to figure out how they're going to pay it, which falls into the affordability issue and the loan issue as well.
Bahar, I want to ask you about what your policy idea at the Hildreth Institute, but maybe it might be first interesting to acquaint our viewers with your mission at the Institute, because this is basically to close a gap in access to higher education.
Thank you for having us over today. Yes, at Hildreth Institute, we had a mission centered around ensuring that all these opportunity gaps that are actually resulting in achievement gaps can be closed. And one of them is definitely student debt, the need to increasingly borrow for higher education, especially for public higher education, is a major problem because it leaves so many students behind in the race. And it also stripes a lot of our local economies out of much needed dollars, because every dollar you pay for debt, you are not investing back into the economy. So that's the mission that we've been setting ourselves, and which kind of resulted into a notion of how can we look into solutions that somehow reduce or eliminate completely the need to borrow. And looking at various data, but also doing a lot of focus group and a lot of based studies, we saw that for really millions that are considering higher education nationwide or in Massachusetts, the cost of tuition and fees can be an important barrier, but also the cost beyond tuition and fees is tripping up a lot of students and are leading them to either borrow excessively or work excessively on the side, which often leads to dropping out of college, which is very difficult to manage because you have debt but no degree.
Now, your idea is zero debt. Contrast that with a tuition-free education, which sounds like a very good deal for most of us, but you think that zero debt makes more sense. Why is that?
So when we look at tuition-free program, unfortunately, most of them are structured in a last dollar basis. It means that it takes all your existing financial aid into consideration and puts it towards your tuition and fees. And whatever remaining gap you have, it's covered by this new grant called the tuition-free grant. But what happens in this scenario, especially at community colleges, for low-income students, most of their tuition and fees are already covered with their existing Pell, their existing Mass grant. So they don't receive any new grant money from a tuition-free program that is structured that way. But of course, for instance, Biden's plan, or there's also plans that are in proposal state in Massachusetts that look at free tuition as a first dollar basis, which is quite more progressive, meaning we will cover your tuition and fee no matter what other aid you have, which then liberates that aid to go start paying for costs beyond tuition, which can be transportation, which can be textbooks, computer software, now that we've passed to, of course, remote learning, but also childcare. So higher education is a privilege when we think about all the time that it requires also, and the money that it requires to get that education. So in these times, whenever you focus on tuition and fees covering that portion of the cost of attendance, you ultimately lose a lot of interest from especially low-income students who cannot afford the cost beyond tuition and fees. So our proposal looks at the full cost of attendance and start to target aid into the unmet need section, meaning we look at the expected family contribution, we look at the financial aid that the students get, and eventually compare that to the total cost of attendance. And when there is a gap, that's where we believe that the financial aid should be allocated.
Anastasia, an idea like this could benefit students of all backgrounds, but what about racial disparities in the effect on family incomes when they want to have their children get higher education? What do you see out there?
Yeah, so a big thing that we're seeing is when you look at the net price of public higher education in Massachusetts, net price meaning we take everything that it costs to go to college, subtracting any aid that students are receiving. It takes up a larger percentage of Black and Brown students, their family's median income. And then even apart from that, when we're looking at who's going to our public institutions, Black and Brown students are more likely to attend these institutions. They're more likely to graduate from these institutions. And then when they're graduating from these institutions, they're more likely to stay in state, right? And when they're staying in the state, they have good jobs, they're paying taxes, more tax dollars are going into the economy. They're creating different groups of connections that they're making, different networks that they're creating. And so overall, they're helping our economy, and they're even just helping the well-being of our communities.
Yeah. Going back to Bahar, another question, and whether it's with zero debt or with some of the other ideas that are being circulated now, such as loan relief or loan forgiveness, you want to help people in need, but you don't want to spend even more to help people who are not in need. How do you avoid that problem?
So, I mean, there is a way of targeting cancellation as well, but even when we look at canceling $10,000, $20,000, we find that the lion's share of the outstanding student debt is among the lower economic status individuals. So studies are increasingly pointing to the reality that the more debt cancellation we have, the more racial wealth inequality will be reduced. So we are definitely for looking to the past, in the sense that these students have been burdened by student debt, and that's actually the same population that is now kind of burdened by the coronavirus and its economic destruction. So canceling student debt is certainly a solution, an economic stimulus, because it would help that population kind of either kind of get out of their debt and contribute to the economy. But while I say that, I also strongly believe we cannot fail our future generations and the future of our economy as well. And I think this is really time to look at a big reinvestment in higher education that should be part of the rebuilding efforts after this pandemic, because we know that a better educated nation raises productivity, innovation, entrepreneurship, competitiveness, and civic engagement. So there has never been a better time to really have a bold and ambitious reinvestment in higher education with the goal of reducing the student debt that is mostly affecting students of color, African Americans, Black students, and we need to find a way to also close the gaps and not saddle them with debt that they won't be able to manage in 5 years from now.
Anastasia, it's common knowledge we had this big knowledge economy in Massachusetts, and we have all these prestigious private colleges drawing people from all over the world. So why do we need to spend more on the public version of that?
That's a really good question, a really interesting question as well. And I think it really falls into how we view public higher education, right? We have K through 12 education here, which is incredible. And I think that the way we think about higher education needs to change, right? There are folks here who have been here for a long time, who have invested in the economy here, who have paid taxes into it. And I think that it's only right that folks who want to go to higher education and want to have that experience are able to, right? And I think that it's really, again, looking at it as a public good.
Okay. Well, thank you both very much for being with us. I'd like to thank Anastasia Martinez and Bahar Akman Imboden. And we'll have more news in just a moment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.